Let's take you to the US because we are, 3 days on from the result of the elections, and to be a fly on the wall right now amongst the Democrat camp because there's a lot of finger pointing, soul searching, wound licking, backside kicking no doubt as well after the US election defeat. The former House Speaker, one of the country's most powerful politicians, Nancy Pelosi, telling reporters, well, the party would have fared much better if Joe Biden stepped aside. Meanwhile, we're hearing other significant figures and former aides saying it wasn't Joe Biden. For example, one of his former aides telling Politico, an Axios news agency, that President Obama was at fault for accusing him basically of publicly encouraging Democratic infighting to push Joe Biden out earlier this year. So the game of blame begins. Well, sometimes you just need a diplomatic sense of what's going on. And right now we're lucky to go to Rome and speak to Anthony Gardner, former US ambassador to the EU under the second President Obama administration. He's now senior advisor to the Brunswick Group, advising on geopolitical risk. A delight to have you on the programme, Anthony. First of all, listening to some of the comments today, and there are many others as well pointing fingers, where would you look now if you had to kind of source where things fell apart for the Democrats?
Well, I agree with Nancy Pelosi, right? I agree with her because although I love Joe Biden, I worked for him and have a lot of respect for him, he did promise that he would be a one-term president. And then he changed his mind, and then he took 26 days after that catastrophic debate to decide to step down. And we lost a lot of time. I think Kamala Harris ran a very good, strong campaign in the time that she had. It was not easy. I hope we don't descend into infighting here, but there are lots of lessons to be learned. I was worried that we were going to lose this election about 2 months out from the actual date, November 5. And I was worried for a whole bunch of reasons. But first, the questions that are asked to the electorate, first, who do you trust to manage the economy? And second, do you think the country is going in the right direction? Consistently over months, the answer to that question was not Kamala Harris. It was Donald Trump. And that was very worrying. We have also lost a significant support from two key demographics, as widely reported. First, Latino Americans and African Americans. Those have been two demographics that have been over many, many years staunchly Democratic. So there's a lot of lessons that we're going to need to learn from this defeat.
You bring me on nicely to another number of comments that are kind of looking towards what went wrong. Let me mention to you Richie Torres, another Democratic New York congressman, who said this on X, formerly Twitter, today, saying that he blames the far left. He said, quote, radicals within the party managed to alienate historic numbers of Latinos, blacks, Asians, Jews from the Democratic parties with absurdities about defund the police from the river to the sea. We also have Congressman Tom Suzy, New York Democrat congressman, saying the election was lost because the Democrats were too politically correct. What's your take on both of those?
Yeah, look, that's only partly correct. There are marginal groups within the Democratic Party that have been pushing rather marginal fringe issues, and you mentioned a few of them. But let's not exaggerate. That does not represent the Democratic Party by any means, whether you're referring to the wokest agenda, which exists but is pretty fringe, or whether it's radical pro-Palestinian views, which exists but is pretty fringe. I think the issues were much broader and more significant. One of them, I think, is inflation. We didn't talk about it well enough. There were serious concerns, not just a Republican-led misinformation campaign. Partly, yes, but a lot of Americans cared about that issue. And it's not enough to say, well, things are great, right? Because the felt experience was very different from the statistics. And that is a lot of Americans were either having difficulty reaching month end because of credit card debt and mortgage debt and so on. We could have talked about it differently. And on immigration, I think that was another very big issue. Clearly, we could have talked about it differently. Legislation was blocked in Congress because the Republicans clearly understood this was a useful issue to beat Democrats up with. But there were probably things we could have done without legislation earlier on.
It's very interesting. I was talking yesterday to Andrew Yarrow, one of the former speech writers for the Obama administration, and his point was that he didn't believe there was any Democrat candidate that could have stood the test against Donald Trump, given that the moment, the kind of zeitgeist around him right now, his ability to tell stories, weave dreams, to sell nightmares, to sell fear. The only one he picked out, he said, was not a candidate, but he said Michelle Obama, the rhetoric she has. He needed somebody strong. Where do you stand on that? Do you think the Democrats could have actually put somebody else up and stood a chance against Donald Trump, given what they were up against?
Well, it's always easy to look in the rearview mirror, right, after the events have happened. I do think that Michelle Obama would have won this election handily, but she didn't want to run, and I respect her reasons for not wanting to run. She has paid her dues over 8 years. There are other candidates, but many of them had, each of them, specific issues that indeed would have made it complicated for them to win. But the party coalesced over around one candidate. I thought it was the right decision. Given the shortness of time that we had, we really should not have welcomed an open convention. It would have been absolute mayhem. So I think that was the right decision. There are others who I think can communicate probably more effectively. And frankly, I think we now need to look to, I hate to say this, a white, male, centrist, moderate, who can connect with those voters with whom clearly we have not connected. And I think we can do that. Look, it is remarkable to me, I've been a Democrat for decades, that the Republican Party has successfully monopolized the narrative of the American dream, saying to voters, if you want to be successful, you should be voting Republican. And Republicans are always the best stewards of the economy, and we're going to make life fair for you. And this is absolutely incredible. A man who's grown up in the most privileged circumstances imaginable, has never paid tax, who is cheated for many years, has managed to convince people, I'm your guy. I will make your life better.
Very interesting, Anthony. So in a sense, when you talk about, a white, male, centrist to take on Trump, I'm reminded of, your old boss, President Obama, saying that, his accusations to the black community, saying, I get the sense you're just not feeling a woman right now. In terms of trying to get the American public on board, of vast swathes of voters enough to win the election, you're saying actually it's not a winnable path at the moment.
Well, it needs to be a winnable path. I mean, we have to treat those voters with the respect that they deserve, clearly. And anything that goes in a different direction is counterproductive, as we've seen. Even arguably Obama's last intervention with the African American community was not helpful. These people are voting for a reason. We have to listen to them. And many people, I'm convinced, are voting that way because they feel denigrated. And, Donald Trump has, again, quite brilliantly managed to connect with their sense of anger about elites and feeling left behind. But in my view, it's going to be counterproductive. A lot of those people who voted for him are actually voting against their interests. Now, that sounds like a very elitist thing to say, but that probably is what is going to happen.
Very interesting. And I guess in some sense that you probably agree that there needs to be some bloodletting right now, some blood on the dance floor as they work out where they need to go. I'd like to get your thoughts, because I know you were part of the conversation earlier today on a radio station where Brian Lanza, a Republican Party strategist, put, close confidant of Donald Trump, said basically for Ukraine and where they go next, his advice was to President Zelensky, Crimea, if you want to continue arguing for Crimea, then you're on your own. What did you make of that?
Well, I'm not surprised. That's very much part of the narrative, but it's beyond that, because the issue is that the incoming administration will say to Zelensky, by the way, we're not only going to block your entry into NATO, we are not going to provide you with any serious form of security guarantees. That's the problem, because if an unjust peace is forced on Ukraine, saying you give up all the territories that Russia now has, in addition to that, we are only going to give you weak security guarantees that fall short even what we provide to other allies like Taiwan and Israel. That's problematic, because that sows the seeds of future conflict and more appetite for Putin to march further. By the way, a lot of people do not mention, nor did Lanza mention, a little detail, which is rather important. There's the Budapest Memorandum, whereby, this is back in the late 90s, whereby a number of countries, including the United States and the UK and Russia, recognized the borders of Ukraine. and provided them with security guarantees, which of course we have now ignored, and Russia has invaded Ukraine. That's a pretty important detail. We signed that document. And Zelensky, quite rightly, now believes, well, I'm not going to just sign a piece of paper. I want something that actually means that the country, a rump country, let's say, is defensible, and allies will come to my aid.
It really feels there are tectonic shifting lines, doesn't it, right now, of a new world order, a realignment of sorts. And given your job at the Brunswick Group at the moment, advising geopolitical risk, I'm just minded to ask about how busy you are with European clients right now and the unpredictability of a Trump administration.
Very. And we're not alone, of course. There are others who are very busy giving advice to clients who are very concerned about the unpredictability of the world. It's not just Ukraine. It's not just NATO. I actually don't think, there's a risk that the U.S. is going to pull out of NATO. I think the number one issue is trade, where, Trump is serious. Tariffs he's already used in the first term. I think he's going to use them again. He has the power to do so. He won't be challenged to do so. Look, both houses are under Republican control. And the courts are not going to stop him from doing what he says, 60% tariffs on China and 10 to 20% tariffs on Europe. And this is at a time, as we know, where Europe is extremely fragile and fragmented. And if Europe does not follow on the path of the U.S. in putting those kind of tariffs on Chinese goods, which it won't, there will be displacement, I think, of Chinese exports that were going to the United States, now to Europe. That is going to be of massive consequence to many companies.
Very interesting. I'm minded of Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, at the Budapest meeting yesterday, talking about think not of what America can do for you, think of what Europe can do for itself. And big questions there. Delight to talk to you, Anthony. Anthony Gardner, former US Ambassador to the EU, Senior Advisor to the Brunswick Group. Have a good evening in Rome. Thank you, Brian.